And let me just say that, as usual, our discussion is being recorded. So welcome to the 5th discussion hosted by the International Association of Catholic Bioethics in a series entitled Ecology, Health and Bioethics. The title of today's discussion is Indigenous and Christian Wisdom in Dialogue. Now let's begin with the advice of the Apostle James to his local community. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and wisdom will be given to him. Now I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Australia. Our webinar series began with discussion about whether there is a case for healthcare to expand its concern about patient care to public health, and within public health to expand its concern from the social conditions necessary for health, that's education, food sufficiency, access to healthcare, etc., to healthy environments, threatened, for example, by pollution and climate change. We also discussed the ethical challenges presented by the significant environmental costs, only recently acknowledged, of providing healthcare, especially hospital and high-tech care. Our second webinar tackled the One Health concept, which recognises humans as one of many interdependent participants in a planetary ecosystem, all of which need to be in harmony for health to prevail. Promoting the health and flourishing of all may be more difficult to achieve in practice than in theory, for sometimes the goals of increasing biodiversity, promoting human health and well-being, and protecting what is sometimes called the rights of animals, plants, and even of the land are in conflict. In our third webinar, we explored the notions of stewardship and integral ecology, both philosophically and theologically, in connection with a specific issue, the human relation to food, its production, distribution, and consumption. We began to examine the notion of sustainability as the fundamental concern in relation to human development, for it sometimes entails producing more food, for example, increasing crop or animal yields, without addressing the need for better nutrition and food habits, changing unjust structures, promoting ethical ways of treating animals, or indeed addressing other environmental concerns. Well, when we write a consensus statement every few years, we express each recommendation philosophically and then theologically. We do this in order to ensure that our recommendations will make sense to everyone in healthcare, atheists, agnostics, as well as theists. But this topic will require taking account of more complex disciplinary contributions. And so, in our fourth webinar, we discussed an approach called social ecology theory, which offered the opportunity for us to draw on the insights of a range of disciplines. Our speakers explained the principles of that theory and showed how they can help us both to understand the disorder created by the recent pandemic, and remember that we may be entering a stage of pandemics, and to bring Catholic social theory to address these questions. Throughout these webinars, our overarching aim has been to consider whether the Christian ethical tradition has something distinctive to offer to the contemporary secular project called One Health. Today, in the last of our webinars, we bring that tradition into conversation with Indigenous perspectives. We have two wonderful speakers. Christine Jamieson, PhD, is Associate Professor in the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Her areas of expertise are Christian social ethics, bioethics, and Indigenous spirituality. She has Indian status with the Boothroyd Band in Clackmar Nation in the Fraser Canyon, British Columbia. And our second speaker, Tony Snow, is a member of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and Tony grew up on Treaty Number 7 land at Morley, Alberta, where his father, Dr. Reverend Chief John Snow Sr., attended the Morley Indian Residential School. Tony is a day school survivor who now works as the Indigenous Minister of the United Church of Canada's Chinook Winds region and is part of the ministry team at Hillhurst United in Calgary. Tony will be ordained on the 25th of this month, on the very day that he plans to travel to our in-person colloquium in Rome. As a traditional knowledge keeper, minister, and consultant, Tony's worked for decades in public engagement and government relations, and he brings awareness and healing to communities of faith and Indigenous people as a continuation of his father's work and of his grandfather's work. Well, our two speakers will have about 20 minutes or so to outline their contributions to our thinking. We'll then offer them 5 minutes or so more, if they would like, to engage directly with each other before we open the meeting to a wider discussion amongst all of us. And when we come to that point in the proceedings, I'll hand things over to Bill Sullivan of the University of Toronto, the chair of our academic committee, who will explain how the discussion will be managed. So Christine, a very warm welcome, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Just hold on a second. Yes. Okay. Everybody can see that okay, Bill?
Yes,
okay.
Great.
So what I want to do in my 20 minutes or so, and I'm hoping that my 20 minutes start after I do the land acknowledgement. But I want to do a land acknowledgement and then just speak briefly about a tool of analysis that Bernard Lonergan calls 3 levels of the good. Speak a bit about the encounter between the Canadian Indigenous delegation and Pope Francis, move into something a little bit to do with Laudato Si and Indigenous spirituality and ethics and land. And then in the second part, talk about very specifically the determinants affecting Indigenous people's health in Canada. And then just end with looking at an ethic of responsibility and spiritual nature of, and the spiritual nature of all existence. So that's just a quick run through. I do want to acknowledge that I am located on unceded Indigenous land here in the Ganikahaqa Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters we now call Montreal. So I sincerely and respectfully thank the Ganikahaqa people for allowing me to live on this land and to be with you this afternoon from this land. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about land acknowledgement and why it's so important. Land acknowledgement really brings us to awareness of our relationship to the land. But in particular, it brings us to ask the question, whose land are we on? Whose land are we on? And there's a book by Suzanne Keeptu, who is called "We All Go Back to the Land." And what she says about land acknowledgements is this: she says that land acknowledgement should be done to bring us to awareness and truth, and to Canadians, because this is in the Canadian context, to bring awareness and truth to Canadians and foster our relationships between Canadians, Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. The acknowledgement should be done to help heal the land so it will sustain us and those who come after us. So there's many different readings of land acknowledgement, and I even invite you, if you care to put into the chat where you're coming from this afternoon or this evening or this morning, whatever time frame you're in. So I just also wanted to say a word about who I am and the land I'm connected to. So my roots, as you heard in the introduction, are in British Columbia, Canada. My mother was born in Union Bay on Vancouver Island, and she grew up in Victoria, British Columbia. Her mother was from England and her father was from Ireland. My father was born in Kamloops, British Columbia. His mother was from Holland and his father was from the Boothroyd First Nation, Interior Salish and Cluckma Nation in the Fraser Canyon near Boston Bar, British Columbia. And I'm very privileged to now be a member of the Boothroyd First Nation. Before I begin, I wanted to briefly explain a tool of analysis that I will use in my presentation. The tool is drawn from the thought of Bernard Lonergan. It has to do with understanding the good as operative at three different levels. The first level is the good of the individual, and that can best be described as satisfaction. The good is what satisfies us in relation to our personal interest or our personal desire. While there is nothing intrinsically wrong with being satisfied, we need to eat, we need to sleep, etc. We live in a world with other people, and to live together in harmony, we must strive for the good that goes beyond merely our own personal desires. So the second level of the good of society or of social orders, fulfills this in calling for a commitment to social order. We set up social structures that allow us to achieve goods far beyond what any of us could achieve on our own. However, when exploring issues that have to do with ecology and ethical healthcare, we must also consider these issues against a wider frame of reference. This wider frame of reference is the third level of the good, or what Lonergan calls terminal value, because it is the ultimate or end value of what we seek when we seek the good. At the third level, we ask, is my choice at the first level or our choice at the second level worthwhile? Is it truly good? Our point of reference in answering this question necessarily is broader than the concerns of one individual or one society. The criteria we use in making decisions from a third level perspective must transcend the criteria that we use when we only consider ourselves or our group. So in what follows, this wider frame of reference becomes crucial in thinking about root causes of environmental destruction and subsequent human harm. In Pope Francis's apology delivered on April 1st, 2022, he makes several observations from his encounter with his guests, the Canadian delegates from the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people of Canada. He is struck by a saying that is part of Indigenous peoples' traditional wisdom, a way of viewing life, as Pope Francis says. In every deliberation, we must consider the impact on the seventh generation. The Pope says that these are wise words, far-sighted, and the exact opposite of what often happens in our own day, when we run after practical and immediate goals without thinking of the future and generations yet to come. The third level of the good comes immediately to mind. Pope Francis draws on the image of a tree in pointing to Indigenous peoples being, what he says, solidly anchored to their roots, which is what kept them strong in face of the destructive forces that worked against them. As Pope Francis says, Indigenous peoples, despite the harm, have continued to bear fruit, and he indicates that this fruit deserves to be better known and appreciated. The Pope expresses it this way: first, your care for the land, which you see not as a resource to be exploited, but as a gift from heaven. For you, the land preserves the memory of your ancestors who rest there. It is a vital setting, making it possible to see each individual's life as part of a greater web of relationships with the Creator, with human community, with all living species, and with the earth, our common home. The Pope notes that the sacredness of nature for Indigenous people and the deep wisdom and understanding our sacred relationship with all beings, human and non-human. It's striking to note the convergences between Pope Francis's encyclical titled Laudate Si, or In Praise of Creation, and the relationship Indigenous people have with the land and with all non-human beings. In Laudato Si, he speaks of the importance of third-level analysis. Caring for ecosystems demands far-sightedness, he says, since no one looking for quick and easy profit is truly interested in their preservation. This resonates with what he noted in his apology about his Indigenous visitors, the wisdom of recognizing that in every deliberation, we must consider the impact of the seventh generation. In Laudato Si, he identifies the crisis of what he calls excessive anthropocentrism that blocks our ability to understand our relationship and responsibility to the earth and all human and non-human beings. And in chapter 4 of Laudato Si, titled Integral Ecology, Pope Francis emphasizes the interrelatedness of all creation. Integral ecology is at the heart of the encyclical's proposal. It represents a new paradigm of justice because it recognizes that we are all part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. For Pope Francis, integral ecology is inseparable from the common good. Thus, justice is for those who are most gravely affected by the environmental crisis, for now, both now and in the future. The new form of justice must take both into consideration. The final chapter, titled Ecological Education and Spirituality, speaks of the need for a change of heart and a moral imperative to heighten our consciousness of the impact of our actions. What kind of world, he asked, do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? Pope Francis's encyclical is organized around that central concept of integral ecology. It brings the reader's attention to the interconnectedness of all beings, human, non-human, vegetation, water, and the land. All are interconnected, therefore thinking and acting through the lens of the common good is essential. To not do so not only destroys our common connection with nature, it also destroys ourselves in the process. In reflecting on Indigenous spirituality and ethics and the land, like Pope Francis's encyclical, it sheds light on our relationship to nature. Indigenous peoples have a core connection to the land and to all non-human beings. Their footprints on the earth are such that the decisions they make today are sustainable for 7 generations to come. They are attentive to a wider horizon and the impact of their actions will have on future generations. Here is a quote that expresses this quite well, I think. In North America, many Indigenous traditions tell us that reality is more than just facts and figures collected so that humankind might widely use resources. Rather, to know it, reality, requires respect for the relationships and relatives that constitute the complex web of life. I call this Indigenous Realism, and it entails that we, members of humankind, accept our inalienable responsibilities as members of the planet's complex life system, as well as our inalienable rights. Another quote that makes a link between colonization and the ecological crisis that we face is this. Inuit culture is based on the ice, the snow, and the cold. It is the speed and intensity in which change has occurred that continues to occur that is a big factor in why we are having trouble with adapting to certain situations. Climate change is yet another rapid assault on our way of life. Yet it cannot be separated from the first waves of changes and assaults at the very core of the human spirit that have come our way. Just as we are recognizing and understanding the first waves of change, our environment and climate now gets threatened. In reference to this final quote, the first waves of changes and assaults refer to the European settlers coming to Turtle Island or North America. The key assault was colonization. There is a direct correlation between the ecological crisis and the European approach to the land and nature. That approach is described by bioethicist Daniel Callahan as viewing nature as plastic. In this perspective, human beings are separate from nature, above nature, and humans use nature in any way that serves their needs and desires. Nature is totally at the disposal of human beings. This approach exhibits a profound disconnect between human beings and nature. However, the disconnection really is an illusion evidenced by the destruction human beings have brought to nature. Indigenous peoples have always understood their deep connection to nature. They do not see themselves above nature, but rather just as much a part of nature as any other being. Different forms of colonialism disrupted the relationship Indigenous people have with nature. For example, environmental destruction, land dispossession, or forced relocation have ended Indigenous peoples' local relationships to thousands of plants, animals, insects, and entire ecosystems. The integral relationship of Indigenous peoples with ecosystems was disrupted by colonialism, but their living memories and their felt knowledges remain. In their traditional teachings, Indigenous peoples promote and operate consistently from the third level of the good. Their decision-making and actions regularly take into account both past generations and future generations. How would my actions and future generations impact the situations we find ourselves in today is a question that might be asked. It is routine for Indigenous peoples to reflect on the past and into the future to inform decisions and actions that they make in the present. This points to an interconnection, not only with the land and all human and non-human beings, but also with those who have gone before us and those who will come after. I suggest this way of being and acting in the world fits well with Pope Francis's vision of an integral ecology. And it is also what he notes in his encounter with the Canadian delegation in Rome recently. In the second part of my presentation, I deal with the concrete impact of the rupture from the land Indigenous peoples were connected to. Sorry, I'm going to just repeat that line. The second part of my presentation deals with the concrete impact the rupture from the land Indigenous peoples were connected to has had and continues to have on Indigenous health. What has been coined as determinants of Indigenous health, and certainly the core determinant, is the disruption of peoples from their land. Charlotte Reading, in her chapter from an important book titled Determinism of Indigenous Peoples' Health in Canada, she identifies 3 levels of determinants affecting Indigenous peoples' health in Canada, what she calls the proximal, the intermediate, and the distal. Using this framework to analyze determinants is a valuable tool. It explains why it is so important to understand the Indigenous worldview and horizon of value, as well as Indigenous people's experience since the European colonizers arrived in Canada. As Reading and many other Indigenous scholars emphasize, European colonization is so endemic and far-reaching in its deleterious impact on Indigenous peoples that many of the current health problems Indigenous peoples in Canada face today can be linked to the residue of colonization. I will explore this briefly by drawing on Reading's chapter and exploring the 3 determinants. She uses the image of a tree the image of a tree with branches, trunk, and roots to explain the differences between the 3 levels of determinants. The first level, at first, there are the proximal determinants of Indigenous people's health, which Reading aligns with the crown of the tree, that is the leaves and the branches. Included here are conditions that have a direct impact on physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual health. At this level, we identify determinants that are immediate, most obvious, and that can be clearly observed and tracked. Examples of these determinants are early child development, income, social status, education, literacy, social support networks, employment, working conditions, occupational health, physical environment, culture, and gender. Because Indigenous peoples are disadvantaged in all these areas, they suffer emotionally, physically, spiritually, and mentally. Reading identifies the clear indicators of this disparity: poverty, discrimination, lack of education, unemployment, poor working conditions, and inadequate or harmful physical environments. Second, there is the intermediate determinants of Indigenous peoples' health in Canada. Let's again, I just wanted to remind us that this is the context out of which this is written. Looking again at the tree metaphor, this level should align with the trunk of the tree. Here, the determinants are not as obvious and immediate, but it is possible to link a disintegration of the holistic health of Indigenous peoples with determinants at this level. Just as the trunk of the tree is a link between the roots and the branches, intermediate determinants mediate between distal determinants and proximal determinants. The presence or absence of immediate determinants profoundly influence the immediate health of Indigenous peoples. Reading gives the example of poor accessibility to healthcare services for many Indigenous peoples living in remote areas in Canada, leading to diminished screening, late diagnosis, and negative outcomes. Conversely, when Indigenous peoples have access to intermediate determinants such as ceremonies and knowledge sharing, the positive impact on all dimensions of their existence, physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional, is seen. Thus, intermediate determinants can be thought of as conduits through which positive cultural community or cultural continuity or negative structures, inequitable healthcare and educational systems impact an Indigenous person's immediate health. Third, distal determinants of Indigenous people's health, reading links to the roots of the tree. If one does not pay attention to the roots and focuses attention only on the immediate and obvious pathologies, efforts to change the situation will be undercut. Reading writes, quote, "Just as maladies observed in the leaves are generally not the cause of unhealthy trees, inequities in human health frequently result from corruption or deficiencies in the unseen but critical root system." Reading wants to draw our attention particularly to these deeply embedded determinants, the historical, political, ideological, economical, and social foundations, which includes also Indigenous worldviews, spirituality, self-determination, from which all other determinants evolve. Distal determinants are deeply embedded and are the root cause of the structures of both immediate, intermediate, and proximal determinants. The basic roots of distal determinants negatively affecting Indigenous health are colonization, racism, social exclusion, and repression of self-determination. In considering the levels of the good in relation to the different levels of determinants, it is of vital importance to keep in mind third-level criteria in human living. When Charlotte Reading and other Indigenous scholars emphasize the role colonization plays in concrete health issues among Indigenous peoples, it pushes us to ask the question, what was the truly good and truly worthwhile that colonization disrupted? The truly good and the truly worthwhile of Indigenous existence is what needs to be recovered when we concern ourselves with Indigenous peoples in health in Canada. Understanding this is important because short or medium-term solutions will not be sustainable without awareness of and attention to the third level of the good upon which colonialism wreaked havoc. Colonialism is a root or structural determinant that only third-level analysis can tackle. It is an ideology that is embedded in the psyches of most Canadians in such a way that it does not receive the needed attention to address the system's colonialist influences that have a negative and destructive impact on Indigenous peoples in Canada, on Indigenous peoples' health in Canada. Finally, Following Pope Francis and Indigenous spirituality and ethics, recognizing the spiritual nature of all existence is crucial in reflecting on our responsibility in face of the ecological crisis. Responsibility takes on a new meaning in light of the global impact our actions are having, both now and in the present and on the future. Responsibility is more than something we take on in our relationship with others. Rather, our human condition is such that we are defined first by our responsibility to others and to history. There is a deep resonance between Pope Francis's encyclical and Indigenous spirituality. A Lakota phrase commonly used among Indigenous peoples is all my relations. It is a ritual formula that is often recited in Indigenous prayers of gratitude. The words are a powerful reminder that human beings are related to everything. We are interconnected with all existence. It is a connection that is both physical and spiritual. It refers to good and proper relations with the all-inclusive life of the Great Spirit Creator, with other than human life, as well as with all human peoples. In addition, all my relations recognizes the interconnection between the past, the present, and the future. Pope Francis's urgent call to protect our common home and for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet requires a commitment to consistently reflecting on the third level of the good in our decisions and actions. The Indigenous peoples of the world, who have suffered more than most the ravages of colonization that considers nature as plastic and so malleable to human desire, are sources of wisdom who must be included in the new dialogue. They recognize the deep spiritual and physical connection of all beings. As Anishinaabe scholar Kathleen Absalon asserts, Indigenous knowledge, quote, has a capacity to heal ourselves, our families, our communities, nations, and the earth. Indigenous holistic theory is a theory for balance, harmony, and the good life. Thank you.
Christine, thank you very, very much for an absolutely wonderfully rich setting of the scene and first contribution to our discussion today. Thanks a million, Christine.
You're welcome.
So I'll now ask Tony Snow to give us his contribution to today's topic. Tony, over to you.
Thank you so much. My connection might not be top notch, but we will continue. And if you have any issues, please put them in the chat and maybe someone can identify that if we start to slow down. Thank you. So today, I just want to share a bit about the journey that we take through healing paradigms and awareness, but from a theological perspective, and trying to bring an awareness that we see within some of the current dialogues that we have, especially around this issue of bioethics. And so I'm prepared a smudge here to offer a cleansing and a purification as we do. Our Indigenous elders do this every day. And this is part of our communion with God and part of our original instruction to be faithful stewards in our practice. And so we offer a prayer, the Lord's Prayer in my language, the Stony language, the Assiniboine people. Jesus Christ, Amen. And so, as I'm offering a bit of a context here, I'm just going to quickly identify some of the ways in which we are centered in the land and why that's important when it comes to focuses around healing, focuses around our worldview, and the integration of creation into our theology, but also to the ways and practice that we have traditionally had. So for me, this mountain, Mount Iamnathka, is a holy mountain. It is the seat of God in our land. It is a place where God sits. It's a place where we go to go for vision quest or for ceremony, where we want to commune with God. And this is just outside the reserve boundary. It is in a space that is blocked off by a national park for the province. And we are unable to access this mountain as a holy site. And so we have a number of different people that engage in rock climbing on this mountain that in other ways disturb the site. And yet we cannot go to this site for prayer. We cannot go to this site for our ceremony, for our vision quest, for a 4-day vision quest in this area without being encountered with a lot of tourists or other people that are wandering in the area. So there's not, like, it is our temple, but it is not exclusively our use when we're there. And that was not always the case, especially in and amongst Indigenous people who share territory and shared holy sites, that they each respected their time at these sites, and that we would have some way of working around the difficulty of ownership of areas or boundaries. So a bit of a land acknowledgement that I've been using for some of our global work. Our acknowledgement today bridges lands and territories among the whole of creation. In this sacred space, we remember the lands to which we were first called into being. Ancestral lands, holy lands, full of belonging and nurture, lands that spoke our language back to us, whose names we recognize as our ancestral tongues, and to whom we were recognized and known by our places of origin. In this symbiotic relationship, we learned about God, our creator, through the works of creation. And we learned purpose by observing the inner workings of ecosystems and the lives of our cohabitants, the animals, the plants, the rivers, the stars. Each in their own way follow God's plan. In this time of bold discipleship, may we take these lessons of the past and invigorate them with new purpose, for we have much to repair and seek forgiveness for in our zest to rule over nature and nations. As we enter into this current era of change and fracture, may we find new ways of belonging that respect our fundamental traditions of being partners on Mother Earth, living in balance and beauty. And so, as a framing device to look at this instruction coming from one of our traditional elders who taught at the Cook Christian Training School, Methodist Training School, and worked with the Presbyterian Church in the US, delivered this instruction as part of his work. He trained my father while he was alive. And this was the last discussion that we had before he got COVID and passed away. And it says, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. In our tradition, this is the way that my father expressed in his book, These Mountains Are Our Sacred Places, which was written for the centennial of the treaty signing in 1977. Our religion professes faith in one creator and acknowledges the unity and harmony of creation and the harmony of the whole planet, land, animal, bird, plant life, and men. Taking that instruction and looking at it in the context of our biblical understanding. But ask the beasts, as we say in Job 12, and they will teach you. The birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. Or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of everything living thing and the breath of all mankind. And so the connection here is that these words and ideas are spoken in Scripture. These ideas are written down as part of the context of understanding our relationship to creation, but they're not the phrases and approaches that we lift up when we start to look at the Indigenous perspective and understanding. So my father says, for thousands of years, the Stoney people gained an education from the tribal leaders, which fitted them to live with pride and confidence on this great island. They learned the ways of the seasons, the ways of the birds, the animals and birds. They learned which plants and herbs would sustain their good health. They learned their ways of living together, respect for the needs of others, the sharing of the bounty of the hunt, and the meaning of prayer. They learned to survive in all the seasons. They learned the importance of bravery and wisdom. They learned the responsibility of leadership. They did not build schools as the white man does, but the Stony education system was suited to the requirements of free and independent people living in a free land. And this harkens back to Acts 17 for me. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live by the shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation. And in this instruction, it goes further to say that the people would learn of God and they would follow, they would feel after God. And that is the context in which Indigenous people have, in their allotted boundaries, have sought God in the land. In our migrations, as in our vision quest, my people continue to observe the lands, plants, rocks, trees, streams, winds, sun, moon, and stars, and all things. Our teaching has always been that everything was created for a purpose by the Great Spirit. We must therefore respect all things of creation and learn as much as we can. There are lessons hidden in creation that we must learn in order to live a good life and walk the straight path. Behind these lessons and teachings is the Creator. These things can only be understood through the Great Spirit. And so our observation and understanding of God and of Creator is that God is a mystery and God is imbued in all things. And this is our perspective coming to the ideas around our habitation and how we associate with the land. Here in our land-based practice, we often turn to a model where we are observant of the cardinal directions, as we heard earlier. We have an idea of to what each of these spaces symbolize in a quadrant of our understanding, how we bring our experiential ways of engaging with the world into our philosophy about how we are to be with the world. And so in these cardinal directions, each has a particular significance: east, south, west, north. And in this cycle, we begin to see some of the other bigger cycles that exist around our way of thinking, which is the life cycle being a infant, child, adult, and elder, in looking at different ways in which we are engaged with the world around us, with the seasons, so spring, summer, fall, winter, and how we are following in this great message of creation, what creation is about and doing at this time. So when we think about how we are centered in this land, how we are coordinated within this land, we are also looking above to the cosmos, to the heavens above, but the sky above, and how that is an opening into another world. Similarly, looking below, we don't have a term for Hades. We don't have a term for a ruler of the underworld. We don't have a concept around those. So what we have is below, we see the earth and we see our relationship to the earth. And so it's a nurturing environment of everything that comes out of the earth. Here we see on the side that these help us to find ourselves within location, time, and space, and a grounding that we can take with us as we move in and out of different conditions, and has helped us in terms of our healing by knowing where we come from. Here, some of the land-based understanding is tied to the areas that we venerate. So Minewangka, meaning water, Mini means water, Wakan means spirit. So this is a holy lake, a place of vision, a place that tells us about who we are in this space. We speak to the spirits, we pray to those spirits, and we have sacrificial waters, healing pools in these areas that are nurturing and there for our use, but not ours to claim or to hold. Similarly, Minihruwin, Yarhe Arborin, is a traditional healing place, a place of vision. It is called Cave and Basin in Canada. And in the Banff Park, it is the first national park that existed. Once they found this spot, they claimed it a national park, and then excluded all Indigenous people. We were thrown out of the Banff parks and forced to live on our reserves. And this pool in itself is a healing space. It is like a naturally occurring sweat lodge, and it is a dome shape that has a pool of water beneath it that we would go to for healing and for vision. A lot of these places are tied to how we find the healing ways of these lands and of these particular spaces that are already of themselves, and we partake in that by learning how to commune with these spaces. Here, Ihage Nakota, the last Nakota, there's a story in our land where we talk about, just outside of Kamloops, this mountain, which had a derogatory name, and they recently changed it. But our name for it is the story of a man who so loved the area, wanted to stay in this area forever. And so our figure, who is like the first person, who was magical and a godlike person, sort of a powerful person, a holy person, turned them into this mountain. And so there's some connection about how we are embedded in the land and how we understand our relationships to the land. Here, my father says, the old stony medicine man had said, you must continue to go to the sacred mountains. You must fast and pray for many days and nights. Perchance you will see a vision upon the mountains. Before he went to the beautiful land of the spirits beyond the sunset, the old man with a century of experience spoke these words. You must search, and you will find ancient truths and wisdom that shall guide you in the future. My grandfathers told me these things when I was a little boy, and in my youth, it was told to me over and over again by the campfire in the tribal encampment. And so it has been imprinted in my heart ever since that time. And so these connections of how we are instructed and how we are told of our relationship becomes a very important part of that. It's going to play this short video.
This air that I'm sitting here and breathing as you and I talk not only comes from you and shares you in that manner, but it also comes from Oklahoma, South Dakota, Alaska, China, the Thunder Nation. And all of those things combined are now part of me, and the same with the water that I drink and the food that I eat. And the intricate connection that we have is very physical, very scientific, and very spiritual.
So we bring these connections and understanding to how we are engaged with some of the larger stories. And so I'll end in this and just after this. Beloved Amazonia, the Holy Father talks about in the Eucharist, God, in the culmination of the mystery and the incarnation, chose to reach our intimate depths through a fragment of matter. The Eucharist joins heaven and earth. It embraces and penetrates all creation. For this reason, it can be a motivation for our concerns for the environment, directing us to be stewards of creation. And here, for me, it became very interesting because this information that the Holy Father talks about is not something that we've practiced or understood or in any way enacted. And yet here, this lament around what this means is paramount for our time today and how we see the world. In this sense, encountering God does not mean fleeing from this world or turning our back on nature. It means that we can take up into the liturgy many elements proper to the experience of Indigenous people in their contact with nature and respect Native forms of expression in song, dance, rituals, gestures, and symbols. The Second Vatican Council called for this effort to enculturate the liturgy among Indigenous peoples. Over 50 years have passed, and we still have far to go along these lines. And so this calling forth, and we heard similarly from the earlier presentation as well, from Christine, that the importance of how we are being connected to this information, whether or not this information can find cogency in the work that we are doing for Indigenous people trying to work through healing programs, work through a number of different ways that we are to engage. It becomes difficult because we are not given this scope and this calling to bring us to a better understanding. Instead, we are confronted by a lot of misinformation and a lot of words that do not follow in works like this, that are calling us to be a different way, and calling us to understand what our path has been and what we need to be doing. It's saying that we have fallen short and that we are, as a community of everyone, that we are still in need of finding a place to balance our understanding. So it's just in this closing, it is the reconciliation work that we have been involved in the Morley area for the ecumenical movement that had happened here in 1971 to 1978 brought us to a different understanding, to try to work through some of the challenges of being involved with the Indigenous people and the churches that had fractured the Indigenous people by creating polarization on reserves, and to the extent that it was untenable, that faith practitioners who were Christian were ostracized from those who were not. And we find a similar situation today happening. But in this work, there was more of an attempt to build understanding, to build a way of awareness, and to look at redress from these traditions by reconnecting people to their healing traditions, healing in terms of their spiritual necessity and of this holistic idea of how we are to be reintegrated within nature in the work of our people, in the finding of our voice for Indigenous reconstitution of the body and the spirit in our models of wellness, which include mind, body, the emotional centers, and the spiritual centers. So this paradigm of a way of looking at it, healing as wholeness and wellness. And so trying to work from that model into an idea of inclusion and integration. And so these healing traditions come out as was mentioned earlier. Mitakwe Oyasin, which is the all my relations portion, means that we are finding ways to engage, and that through that engagement to understand our relationships of stewardship, of creation-centered contexts, and of holistic interpretations that can come together, bring us to a different understanding of the models that we currently have, and find new solutions by reconnecting those to ancient stories, ancient wisdom, and how we view our relationship to the earth. So I thank you for the time to be able to share, and I will send it back to you.
Tony, thank you very much indeed for a wonderful contribution. What I'll now do is to hand over to Bill Sullivan, and Bill, you're in charge of deciding whether we ask Christine and Tony whether they would like to talk to each other in front of us, or whether we immediately open the discussion to everyone else. So, Bill, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. So my name is Bill Sullivan. I'm the chair of the Academic Planning Committee for the International Association of Catholic Bioethics. And it's my pleasure to moderate this part of our time together. We have about another 30 minutes to engage in this dialogue, which is essentially a dialogue between Indigenous cultures and Christian thinking about health and ecology. And so to kind of try to keep some of our focus on this interconnection between health, ecology, and ethical issues that these different understandings challenge us to think of. I think what I will do first is just invite people as they kind of take a moment to think a little bit about what we've heard. And if you have questions that you would like posed, but maybe don't want to pose them yourself, or even if there's something you would like to ask yourself, if you could just indicate the topic. And John Hang has put some instructions about how to share that in the chat. And then we will just try to organize the questions according to themes. And while we're doing that, I would invite Christine and Tony to just reflect together or among yourselves about, you know, some things that stood out for each of you in what the other has proposed to us.
So maybe I could start. I wanted to just acknowledge Tony's presentation and thank him for it. I was very moved by your speaking of the land and the disconnection that has happened with your people. But I wanted to ask a question about the land itself and your understanding of that relationship to the land, because it seems to me that the relationship to the land is it's almost as though the land is part of who we are, that there's somebody used the word enfoldment between humans and the land. The land is really, I mean, we talk about it as our mother in a sense. And you did mention this idea of to be reintegrated within nature. I guess I just was wondering if that, that understanding of land is so intricately connected to who we are, like as Indigenous people, if that is something that, my understanding of that is accurate. What's your sense of that, Tony?
I think part of that, and it's an interesting discussion, part of that is how we come to the spaces that we're in. And for Indigenous people, a lot of the ways that they're traditionally forming spirituality and faith are grounded in the traditional teachings, that original instruction. And when we talk about those that follow in Christian forms, often from diverse backgrounds, who may or may not have a Hebrew background, may not have a connection to the originary fold of what that scope would be, and how this then extrapolated out from Paul's work, the Apostle Paul, and how this is sort of giving people a context. So it's a different approach to what we are hearing, in terms of if we are given instruction through one of our creation stories, and the connection of how those stories are embedded with our connections, conditions, and what the whole context of our world shall be, that's different than if we are to hypothesize about a creation story that we are not connected to, or that we hear, and that is universalized to the extent that it is said to apply to all. So if we are to look at what are the connections around that, I say this because many Indigenous nations have creation stories, and they're all different, and they have different approaches to understanding who they are. So what is a creation story? Creation story becomes a model of understanding how we are connected and how we are embedded in our cultural context, in the knowledge that we have. And so when we look at how this is disseminated amongst the population, they're done through particular cultural protocols that are handed down either through community transmission in other ways, that there are trusted people who are telling these stories. There are connections and relationships that are important to the relatingness of a story, so that we don't have, as we see in many instances in the Bible, Christ gives an instruction. There's a number of questions that come back and saying, why this, why that? How do we pray? To a lot of the different nuance of what I sort of align with scientific thinking is, okay, is that true? And then try to work through, versus in a Indigenous context where truth value is ascribed and tied to relationship, and is tied to trust in how we understand and engage with new information. And so if we are to then look at how that relationship unfolds because of colonialism and the destruction of communal ties, family relationships, kinship relations, there's a number of ways in which we fall out of that model, and how we are then forced to see things in a way that we have to decolonize first in order to understand where our people have brought this new understanding forward and why that is applicable.
Well, thank you for that, Tony. Did you have anything to raise from what Christine had shared?
In my reading of Laudato Si, there's sort of an impetus to lift up the Indigenous people and their beliefs and their understandings, but not with a sense of what I would kind of say political responsibility, or a way of bringing forward some accountability from the church's perspective to be alongside and to stand there in that moral space of saying the governance systems need to change in these areas. Because in Alberta, in Canada, when the Indigenous people got together and from my particular denomination talked about how they were going to engage with the church, one of the things that they put forward was the statement, nothing about us without us. And so this, I took that to the UN COP 25 in Madrid and related some of this information. They were very enamored with the idea of nothing about us without us. But when I thought about it more, it was something that they could not implement because of the treatment of Indigenous people, because of the rights of Indigenous people and the displacement and execution of many of those groups. So it became very difficult to see how, without sort of a moral arm of the church, that we could be asking groups to promote this idea without that accountability. And so I'm wondering, what does that sound like to you? To Christine.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's a really important question, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning in terms of land acknowledgement and recognizing that, you know, most of us are living on land that has been really stolen, and there's no accountability for it. Like even in the government of Canada is living on stolen land from the Algonquin people. So that political dimension is important. I guess, I mean, I may be a bit idealistic, but I couldn't help feeling that encounter in Rome that happened a few weeks ago was important. Maybe in addressing a little bit of what you're saying, Tony, that coming together and really encountering each other, that the Pope encountering the delegation, the Inuit delegates, the First Nation delegates, the Métis delegates, and they coming, in a sense, what strikes me is they came to his lodge, and now he's coming to their lodge. And I think that might be important in terms of shifting levels a bit to a more accountability. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. I think that with the apologies that happened in the United Church, we had two apologies. One in 1986, that was the apology for colonialism. And it was sort of a generic apology. It's kind of like what we heard from the Pope's apology in Rome. And that in 1998, there was another apology that came forward specifically saying that the church was responsible for the acts that happened and benefited from a lot of the acts that happened for the residential school system. And that there was an apology for that. And that's what triggered the Indian residential school class action suit and the settlement agreement that came out of that was signed by all the denominations in Canada. That so one of the repercussions of that was the declaration of the Indigenous month and of the apology and of the triggering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So all of these things are tied into a line.
Great. So thank you very much for those comments. Just thinking a little bit initially about health, and many of us that are part of this webinar are in healthcare. And one of the things that has struck me from an ethics point of view is this, our typical focus has been on individuals, right? And in much of healthcare, a lot of us are focused on individuals. The pandemic made us rethink how we think about the ethics of healthcare more broadly for communities. And I'm just wondering if in the Indigenous healing sort of way of thinking about health, is there a struggle between the individual and the community, or does that work differently somehow?
I'm not sure if Dr. Jamieson wants to
go ahead, Tony.
Okay.
You go ahead.
I think that if we think about the apologies and the residential school trauma that was inflicted upon the communities as these as these deeds and abuses were coming forward, as these acts of genocide were coming forward, and how this impacted the community. It was felt not only on an individual level, but on a collective level, and on the affront to the community. And the work of the different people who were in that community, especially in the Kamloops area, who were not able to find redress through some of the mechanisms of the death register and other aspects of the agreements, that they were not given any kind of resolution. And so this further enacted the will of the broader community and associated Indigenous communities that can help with, hang on, just one second. So that there are a number of ways that we are impacted collectively, and that a lot of our right systems and a lot of our understanding about how we are as nations is based on the collective rights model that comes out of a relationship with the Crown and other ways that we think as a collective collectivity.
Great. And I don't know if Christine, you wanted to add anything to that, kind of more specifically related to just health and thinking about the environment as somehow a healing force that might be in an Indigenous understanding that we are only, I think, now beginning to appreciate more, that in fact, this sort of relationship with with nature, broader ecology, and even our own bodily nature is it may be helpful to have different ways of thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very struck by the holistic paradigm for Indigenous people in terms of, I mean, think about somebody like I quoted Kathleen Absalon, her really excellent paper titled Indigenous Holistic Theory, a Knowledge Set for Practice. And in it, she really describes this kind of, the importance of those 4 dimensions of the human person: the spiritual, the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual, in a sense, that they're all that they all have to be in harmony, in a sense. And I'm not sure. I mean, the pandemic, I think, did move us to recognize something beyond individual health, but I'm not sure that it's really taken us far enough that in terms of, I mean, I think that that deep connection with the land that I'm continually struck with Indigenous people, like there's that the land is so much a part of who they are, their whole self-identification, and their sense of harmony, their sense of health in the world. And this is not just physical health, but health at all levels: spiritual health, psychic health, emotional health. So I feel that, and this was kind of what I was trying to say in my presentation, like I really felt Charlotte Reading had put her finger on hit the nail on the head, in a sense of really understanding that this disruption that happened from a disconnect from one's culture, one's land, and how it just, I love the image that, although it's a bit startling, that Richard Wagamese used. He says it's like our insides were scraped off of us somehow. And so how can we possibly think about health if we don't take all that into consideration, certainly for Indigenous people? But I really believe that all of us are impacted by, our disconnect from the land, and how it does damage all of us, how it really affects all of our health, in a sense, the whole holistic understanding of health. So those are just a few thoughts.
Great. Thank you for that, Christine. I maybe invite Anna Perkins to share with us a reflection. She had put a little note on this in the chat. She's coming from a Jamaican context. And Anna, if you would like to pose your question, that would be wonderful.
Sure, thank you, and apologies for not turning my camera on, but the internet's a bit unstable. Saying thanks to Tony and to Christine for their presentations, because they've just opened up so much for me. I'm Jamaican, and similarly, we have been impacted quite a bit by colonialism. I'm doing a bit of work now on the Maroon communities, and these are communities of enslaved Africans that would have escaped the plantation and formed their own communities, fought against the colonizers, and actually forced them to sign treaties with them, And part of why I'm struck by what was shared here today, for 2 reasons. The Maroons in Jamaica claim Indigenous status because they claim intermarriage with the original inhabitants of Jamaica, the Taino Indians and so on. So they hold to that heritage, and the genetics seems to support that. And a group of them the Trelawney Maroons were actually deported to, I think it was Nova Scotia, because they were revolting against what the British wanted to force on them. So I wondered, one, whether in the development of and the maintenance of the Indigenous spiritualities in Canada, whether those the spirituality of the Maroons that would have been deported would have had any kind of influence, or did you hear or know about that? And if you had any thoughts on that, that was my first initial thought, then I'm learning more about the whole notion that they have, which I think has been very lost to the majority of Jamaicans because we have been so Christianized, about the connection to the land. So for example, the Maroons in a compound have a tree that they call the kinder tree, which I've now come to understand. It was they really value this tree because it was under this tree that they signed the treaty. But it actually goes beyond that. In the development of the language, the Jamaican language and so on, it's called the kinder tree because it's a way of saying kin is here. And so what I've learned is that they actually see that tree as an ancestor, as part of their community. So when there's discussion and action around ecology, this tree is a person and a persona in the conversation, which makes a huge difference in terms of how they treat with matters of preservation of the environment and that sort of thing, which I'm fascinated by, but not sure how to make the connection across as a Jamaican that has been deeply impacted by Christianity. So I'd love any thoughts either Christine or Tony would like to share in regards to that. Thank you both.
Oh, I guess I could just say a couple of things. Thanks so much, Anna. I really appreciate what you had to say. And I was very struck by, you know, that idea of the tree as our ancestor. And because I mean, in my own encounter with my own Indigenous people, which I spent, you know, a fair amount of time with over the last few years, and then also just being, you know, involved in ceremonies, not necessarily just with the Ecological people, but with other Indigenous groups. I've been very struck by, you know, this understanding. I mean, and I noticed that Corey Lebrecq posed a question about the personhood of non-persons, in a sense, like non-human beings. And you know, I think that there's, I mean, this is just my thinking, and it's not really well developed, but it just seems to me that that the Western kind of way of looking at reality, and I know I'm being so super generalization here, and I know it's not the case with everybody and all that kind of thing, but there is a general orientation, I think, that's Western, that tends to separate reality in order to be able to manage it, in order to be able to study, understand it. I mean, this is important because that's why we were able to come up with a vaccine for the COVID. I mean, if it hadn't been for that. But at the same time, by doing that, it's like, I kind of wonder what we lose if we've lost something. And it seems to me part of what we've lost, and part of why I believe Indigenous people in Canada anyway suffer so much, is that loss of that connection between human and all other than human beings, and how that is so important for our health. And the more that perhaps we can come to see, you know, our relationship with non-human beings and consider them maybe the status of persons, whatever that means, you know, we treat nature better, and we have a relationship with nature. I think that will have a profound impact on our health. I think that, you know, Charles Taylor talks about this idea of this buffer that we have, you know, this kind of buffer between ourselves and nature, in a sense, or so this kind of ability to separate ourselves in a way. And again, I think there's something valuable about that, but at the same time, you know, my question is, you know, has it gone to such an extent that we not only reap the benefits of it, but now we're also causing a huge amount of damage because of it? And can we have both realities? I don't know, you know, I'm not sure, but it's just a few little thoughts there. Don't know if Tony's back on the phone yet.
Yeah, so if you have anything to add, Tony, that would be fine, but otherwise we can move on. So I guess just a comment, Christine, you were referring to the thought of Bernard Lonergan, and one of the distinctions is between description and explanation. And a way that he illustrates that is that the description is the forceps that picks up the specimen, and the explanation is relating that specimen, say it's a frog, to other frogs. And so one can become expert in the description and also expert in the explanation side, which is tends to be what science does. It's relating things. But ultimately, there's these are differentiations of consciousness, but there is this other part of integrating. And even more recently, the idea of even the integration between the two hemispheres of the brain. But anyway, this whole idea of wholeness and integration is, I think, a recurring theme here. And I'll just maybe mention that Bridget Doherty had a question that I think relates to this in the sense of how can nature itself be healing for some of this disintegration? Bridget, would you like to pose your question?
Sure, thanks. I don't know much about it, but I've been reading that, and I think it's quite new, the diagnosis of nature deficit disorder. And so that really came to mind with both presentations, actually. So I wonder if you could speak to how actually nature could be incorporated actually in the healthcare system as a form of medicine.
Well, I'll just say, I just think that's so important what you're saying. I think that, it goes to, again, the disconnect that many of us who live in big cities, we don't have a relationship with nature, and there's all kinds of evidence that, connecting with nature, being in nature, has a healing impact on human beings, on all beings, but on human beings. And so I really would champion that idea of, it's really a different paradigm, isn't it? And it's so hard to think, because when we think of health, and healing, we think about drugs and medicine and hospitals, and is it possible to think outside of that? Is it possible to think that that healing may come from being in nature? I think that, my understanding is that very much Indigenous people would say, and I don't know if Tony's here, but Indigenous people would say, yes, we need to have that component, have that part of our, if we don't, we'll die without it. It's like, it's such an essential part of who we are. And, I can't help feeling that if we live without it, we're really diminished in our potential as to what it means to be a human being in the world. So that's kind of my response. I don't know if Tony's around. Be good to hear him.
Yes, sorry about that. I lost connection for a bit there. I think one of the things that I'd say to that is that we, in our traditions, talk about places of healing, talk about places that are imbued with specific conditions around it, context around how we approach areas, and that those from the theologian Vine Deloria would say, those that know how to effectuate those areas, go and minister to those areas or engage with those areas with the ceremonies and the songs and the other things that we have. When we think about there's a context that I'm thinking about with a Hindu person who was talking about in India, there was work done on specific resonances of particular pools and in a temple, and how that was sort of understood through the science. And yet, when we look at that from an Indigenous perspective, we often have to fight towards the claim of legitimacy, and then from there to have a protection of those sites in a way that we can actually do those studies relevantly, so that we are not, because so many of our sites are now turned into tourist sites or bulldozed by other things, we don't have that history of being able to do that type of work with those sacred spaces, what we are calling sacred spaces. So because of mystical experiences or other ways that we engage those sites, we cannot find the scientific tools to kind of bring us to that other level where some would find specific insights from that. But without a recognition and effort by Indigenous people to be involved in understanding and defining what that is, without disrespecting sort of the spiritual and protocols of those areas. This is something we've never attempted. This is something that we haven't set aside a particular holy site, other than groups like the Black St. Anne, where it was a traditional stony site of veneration of a spirit, and that became more of a Catholic site. And I think the Holy Father will be visiting there when he comes to Canada in the next few weeks.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Tony. I know that time is running short. I'm hoping that I'll just maybe turn it back to Bernadette now to sum up a bit, but I'm hoping that after this, we can each go and get some forest therapy, and maybe, you know, there's also something called llama therapy, you know, animals are therapeutic. That, you know, there's something about connecting with nature that is itself healing. So Bernadette, would you like to sum up for us?
Bill, thank you very much. And I noticed that there were other questions from the participants. At least a couple of people had their hands up, and I'm very sorry that our time has run out. Now, I have to say, Bill, that summing up will be beyond me. Remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to think of health in this wider sense than we did last time, from the individual clinical counter to the public health context. And now we're trying to go wider into the what we're calling an ecological kind of context. And we're trying to identify the ethical challenges when you're thinking of health from that perspective. And to bring the session to a close, really, I just want to pick up a couple of individual things that people said to us that particularly struck me. I was delighted that Tony took us back to the biblical sources of ecology. Now, I don't want to imply that they are the only ancient sources of ecology, but some wonderful references there that I will certainly go back to myself. And Christine said, well, look, when we thought about the pandemic, we were pushed to move from thinking about the ethical issues in the individual clinical encounter to thinking more comprehensively about the ethical issues for individuals as members of groups. But she queried whether we, in that thinking about the collectivity, whether we have really gone comprehensively enough. And that's part, I think, of our challenge. This is breaking new ground for us at the IACB, and I think it's rather difficult stuff. Anna Perkins asked us to think about whether there are different forms of Indigenous knowledge and experience and understanding, when she said to us now, when some of the Maroons from Jamaica were deported to Canada, she asked us what difference did that make to Indigenous thinking in Canada. That is certainly a reminder that there's no one such thing as Indigenous thinking about anything. And Jos then typically said, now come on, there's some really hard questions here. We have to think about the compatibility of the results of health, the investigations of the health sciences from Western thinking, but more generally, with the ontology of Indigenous people with respect to nature. Can we, in what sense do we talk about trees as persons? What's going on there? And he made a suggestion that we have to find some new concepts to capture the dignity and the value of different non-human components of God's creation. So it seems to me that's almost a random, it's hardly a summary, but a random noting of some wonderful things that have been put in front of us today. But it really has been an example of the challenges of bringing the Christian tradition of thinking into dialogue with Indigenous thinking. And I think today's session will be invaluable when we come together in Rome in about 3 weeks to try and write something useful for not just our fellow Catholics, our fellow Christians, but everyone working in healthcare. So on behalf of the IACB, I want to especially thank Christine and Tony for doing the hard yakka, as we say, for us today, and look forward to our bringing what we have discussed and its wider context to our thinking in Rome. So thanks very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you on the next occasion.